On the night of November 20th, 1986, the town of Newtown, Connecticut, was disappearing under a heavy, suffocating blanket of white. A massive early-season snowstorm had turned the landscape into a labyrinth of freezing slush and blinding drifts. Joseph Hine, a local snowplow driver tasked with keeping the roads passable, was making his rounds near the Lake Zor Bridge. It was deep in the early morning hours, a time when the world should have been silent. Yet through the roar of his engine and the howl of the wind, Hine noticed something that defied the logic of the storm. Parked near the edge of the dark churning river was a large truck hauling a heavy-duty industrial wood chipper. A man stood in the biting cold, feeding the machine. Hine watched as the wood chipper's discharge chute sprayed a steady stream of dark, unrecognizable material directly into the icy waters below. In the context of a blizzard, the operation was nonsensical. No one clears brush or prunes trees in the middle of a historic snowstorm. The image remained burned into Hine's mind, a solitary figure working with mechanical intensity against the backdrop of a frozen void. He didn't know it then, but he was witnessing the final stage of a disappearance that would challenge the very foundations of American criminal law. A woman was gone, and according to the man operating that machine, she had simply ceased to exist. The woman was Helle Crafts. At 39, Helle was the embodiment of professional grace. A long-time flight attendant for Pan American World Airways, she was a Danish native who had built a life in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut. She was known for her composure, her kindness, and her unwavering devotion to her 3 children. But by late 1986, the poised exterior of her life was fracturing. The source of the tension was her husband, Richard Crafts. Richard was a man of cold, geometric precision. A commercial pilot for Eastern Airlines, his background was far more complex than his civilian title suggested. He was a former Marine and had worked as a pilot for Air America, a passenger and cargo airline secretly owned and operated by the CIA during the Vietnam War. Richard was trained to operate in high-pressure environments, to navigate shadows, and to understand the logistics of disposal and tactical concealment. He was a man of iron nerves and few words, a combination that made him a respected professional, but a terrifyingly distant husband. By the time the snow began to fall in November, the Crafts' marriage was a ruin. Helle had discovered Richard's long-term infidelities and had recently served him with divorce papers. She was not naive. She understood the man she was married to. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Helle had spoken to friends and her divorce attorney with a chilling level of foresight. She told them that if anything happened to her, they should not believe it was an accident. She was a woman living in a state of calculated dread, occupying the same house as a man who viewed obstacles not as emotional burdens, but as problems to be solved through logistics. On the morning of November 19th, Helle returned home from a long-haul flight from Frankfurt. She was seen by co-workers being dropped off at her driveway. That was the last time any credible witness saw her alive. When Helle failed to show up for her next scheduled flight a few days later, her friends immediately felt the weight of her earlier warnings. They called Richard. He was calm, unnervingly so. He told them Helle had received word that her mother was ill in Denmark and had rushed to the airport to catch a flight home. It was a plausible story for a flight attendant with international ties. However, as the days turned into a week, the story began to shift. Richard told some people she was in Denmark. He told others he didn't know where she was. Perhaps she was with a friend in another state. His professional demeanor remained intact. He spoke to the police with the same detached, authoritative tone he used in a cockpit. He was a volunteer policeman himself in Newtown, a factor that initially bought him a level of trust that a civilian would not have enjoyed. But the cracks in his perfect alibi were beginning to appear, not through his words, but through his movements. Private investigators hired by Helle's friends began to look into Richard's recent activities. They discovered that just before the snowstorm, Richard had purchased a new large freezer. They found that he had rented a heavy-duty brush cutter and, most significantly, an industrial wood chipper. When detectives finally secured a warrant to search the Crafts' home, they found a house that had been meticulously scrubbed. Yet they noticed a rectangular patch of carpet had been cut out of the master bedroom floor. Richard claimed a kerosene heater had spilled, and he had simply removed the stained portion. The investigation had reached a critical threshold. In 1986, Connecticut law adhered strictly to the principle of corpus delicti, the body of the crime. Without a physical corpse to examine, the state could not legally prove a murder had occurred. You could not autopsy a ghost. Richard Crafts knew this. He believed that if he could reduce a human body to fragments small enough, the law would be powerless to touch him. He had spent years flying over the hidden corners of the world. He understood that what cannot be seen cannot be proven. But Richard had not accounted for the emergence of modern forensic science and the persistence of a team that refused to accept the absence of a body as an absence of truth. The police returned to the testimony of Joseph Hine, the snowplow driver. They focused their attention on the Lake Zor Bridge. Under the direction of Dr. Henry Lee, a forensic pathologist who would soon become a global figure in criminal investigation, the search for Helle Crafts moved from the house to the frozen riverbank. The conditions were brutal. The investigators were not looking for a body. They were looking for molecules. They were searching for fragments of a life that had been processed through a machine designed to turn hardwoods into mulch. They began a process that can only be described as forensic sifting, a clinical, microscopic search through tons of frozen mud, melting snow, and river silt. They were looking for the impossible, the remnants of a woman who had been systematically erased. The search at the banks of Lake Zor became a grueling exercise in forensic patience. Under the cold gray sky of a Connecticut winter, investigators realized that the snow was both their enemy and their preservation. The woodchipper had acted as a high-velocity dispersal unit, spraying its contents across a wide radius of the frozen riverbank. To recover what was lost, the team had to treat the shoreline like an archaeological dig. They brought in industrial heaters to melt tons of frozen slush, carefully sifting the resulting mud through fine mesh screens. The process was agonizingly slow. Every shovel of silt was washed and inspected under magnifying lenses. They were looking for anything that wasn't wood, earth, or ice. Soon, the sifting began to yield a haunting harvest. First came the hair, thousands of strands of long blonde hair, many with the roots still attached. Then tiny fragments of bone, none larger than a fingernail, many bearing the distinct jagged marks of a mechanical blade. Each piece was a biological breadcrumb leading back to a single person. The breakthrough came when a detective spotted a glint of gold in the mud. It was a tooth, a single human tooth attached to a small piece of jawbone. Nearby, they recovered a sliver of a fingernail with traces of pink polish still clinging to the surface. For Dr. Henry Lee and the forensic team, these weren't just remains. They were evidence of a violent mechanical deconstruction. The sifting ultimately produced 2,660 strands of hair, 69 bone fragments, and 2 human teeth. The technical challenge was now to prove that these microscopic fragments constituted a body. Forensic odontologists compared the recovered tooth and jaw fragment to Helle Crafts' dental records. The match was perfect. Forensic anthropologists analyzed the bone fragments, determining they were human and had been cut while the bone was still green, meaning the person was recently deceased when the machine was used. The pink nail polish was matched to a bottle found in Helle's vanity. Science was doing what the law had once thought impossible. It was reconstructing a human being from less than an ounce of physical matter. As the forensic picture tightened, the timeline of Richard Crafts' actions began to look less like a series of chores and more like a tactical mission. Investigators discovered that he had spent over $900 to rent the Woodchipper, a machine far larger than anything needed for his property. They found evidence that he had removed the master bedroom's mattress and replaced it just days after the storm. When they used luminol on the bare floorboards, the room lit up, revealing a massive blood stain that had soaked through the carpet and into the wood, despite his attempts to scrub it clean. The prosecution's theory was as cold as the night of the storm. They argued that Richard had killed Helle in their bedroom, likely with a blunt object, while their children slept in nearby rooms. He had then placed her body in the new freezer to solidify it, making it easier to process. On the night of the blizzard, believing the noise of the machine would be masked by the wind and the snow would bury the evidence, he took her to the river. He fed her frozen remains through the industrial woodchipper, aiming the chute toward the water, confident that the current would carry the fragments into the depths of Lake Zor. In 1989, Richard Crafts stood trial. It was a landmark moment in legal history. For the first time in the state, a defendant was being tried for murder without a torso, a head, or a limb to present to a jury. Richard remained a stone, his face a mask of pilot-like detachment. He seemed to believe that the tiny fragments in the evidence jars were too small to weigh against him. But the jury saw it differently. They saw a man who had used his training in logistics and disposal not to serve his country, but to erase the mother of his children. The trial lasted weeks, centering on Dr. Henry Lee's meticulous presentation of the human mulch. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was too circumstantial, that perhaps Helle had simply left and the fragments belonged to someone else. But the DNA of the evidence, the dental matches, and the specific nail polish left no room for doubt. Richard Crafts was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case of Helle Crafts changed the way the world looked at perfect murders. It proved that in the age of science, you cannot truly erase a human being. Richard Crafts thought he could turn his wife into nothingness, but he failed to understand that the truth has a physical weight, no matter how small the fragments. The woodchipper was a machine of destruction, but in the hands of the law, it became the very thing that ensured Helle Crafts would finally be heard. Today, the case remains a testament to the fact that even in the deepest storm, and even in the smallest sliver of bone, the truth remains, waiting to be found.